At the peak of his career, LaDainian Tomlinson wasn't just an NFL star. He was the standard of complete greatness at the running back position, a scoring machine built on discipline and a level of consistency rarely seen in the history of American football. In the 2006 season, he reached a height very few people have ever touched, scoring 31 touchdowns, winning NFL MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, and turning every Sunday into a declaration of absolute dominance, where every defense had to adjust just to survive against number 21 of the San Diego Chargers. Throughout his career, Tomlinson was selected to the Pro Bowl 5 times, earned first-team All-Pro 5 times, led the NFL in key categories like rushing touchdowns, total touchdowns, and scrimmage yards, and closed out his playing days with over 13,600 rushing yards, more than 18,000 scrimmage yards, and 162 touchdowns. Numbers that didn't come from one explosive season, but from years of carrying an entire team's offense. He ran, he caught passes, he scored, he protected the quarterback. He was a quiet leader in the locker room, and when he retired, the name LaDainian Tomlinson was enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame as belated recognition of a legacy that had been obvious for a very long time. But right in the middle of that blazing spotlight, another life quietly existed, where the achievements weren't enough to soothe the pain that built up day after day, where Tomlinson lived two parallel lives for nearly 20 years without anyone truly seeing it. One life was the public image people worshipped, the tireless man, never injured, never complaining, always ready to take the ball one more time when the team needed it. The other life was where his body was worn down with every hit, where every morning began with the familiar ache in his knees, back, and ankles, where willpower had to substitute for physical strength when the strength was gone. He never had a fully celebrated moment that stuck in memory. No Super Bowl ring to cap off all the sacrifices, only the duty to keep standing tall in a system that accepted nothing less than absolute toughness. Every touchdown was reassurance to the world that he was still okay, while every slow walk off the field was a silent admission that the price was growing bigger every day. Tomlinson didn't live two lives to hide or deceive. He did it to survive in a reality where weakness wasn't allowed. And that unbreakable will created a bitter paradox, a legend admired by millions, yet rarely asked what he had to endure to stay upright until the very last day. If you want to keep exploring the stories behind the legends, where the spotlight doesn't hide the price they paid, please hit subscribe to join us on this journey. LaDainian Tomlinson grew up with an absence no child should have to learn to accept so early, the absence of his father. His dad left when Tomlinson was very young, not with a loud separation, not with an explanation clear enough for a child to understand it wasn't his fault, but with a quiet disappearance so complete that at first people thought he was just temporarily gone. But day after day passed, and that door never opened again. No goodbye, no apology, no closing moment for Tomlinson to put an end to the waiting. Just a child facing the reality that some people walk out of your life and never come back, no matter how long you wait. In those years, LaDainian Tomlinson wasn't taught how to talk about the pain, he was taught how to keep living. His mother was strong, strict, relying on faith and discipline to hold the family together, and that toughness was both a foundation and an invisible wall that kept a child from being allowed to be vulnerable. In that house, people didn't sit down to ask why someone left, didn't dig into feelings that might make everything more fragile. Life went on. Work had to be done. Meals had to be cooked, and the kids learned to adapt in silence. Tomlinson learned early that some questions, if asked, won't get answers, and some expectations, if held inside, only make the disappointment grow bigger. He learned not to wait, not to hope, not to expect anyone to come back. While other kids were still allowed to cry, to get upset, to demand their parents' presence, Tomlinson started closing himself off, not because he didn't need those things, but because he understood those needs wouldn't be met. Maturity came to him not as a choice, but as a survival reflex. Each year that passed, he grew a little older than his age, learning to take responsibility for his own emotions before he even learned how to express them. No closure means no ending, and no ending means the pain never truly closes. Tomlinson didn't carry memories of a specific goodbye. He carried the feeling of being left behind. The feeling that if someone important could vanish without explanation, then anything could leave at the moment you least expect it. That feeling didn't turn him into a rebellious or bitter kid. Instead, it made him cautious, careful, and always mentally prepared for the possibility of facing everything alone. He learned not to depend, not to reveal too much, because revealing meant giving someone else the power to leave you again. In Tomlinson's inner world, that absence slowly turned into a harsh life principle. Don't wait for rescue from outside. When he started bonding with sports, especially football, it wasn't just a game or childhood fun. It was a clear structure where everything followed a simple rule. If you fall, you get up yourself. If you're knocked down, you keep moving if you want to stay in the game. On the field, no one stops the play to ask if you're hurt. Off the field, Tomlinson gradually applied that same logic to himself. Every fall on the practice field, every hit, every time he got up and brushed the dirt off his knees, reinforced the belief that relying on yourself is the only way to survive. His father's absence didn't create an explosive tragedy. It created a quiet undercurrent that eroded emotions over time. Tomlinson grew up carrying a nameless, shapeless void that was always present in his decisions. He never spoke about that pain out loud, never turned it into a story to seek sympathy, but the long silence itself showed how deeply it had rooted. Some pains get lighter when shared, but some pains, if shared, would expose the fragility a child once learned to hide in order to survive. From very early on, Tomlinson learned the first and cruelest lesson of his life. The world doesn't owe you an explanation, and people don't always come back. If you fall alone. If you want to keep going, you have to stand up yourself. That lesson didn't leave him as he grew up, didn't disappear. When he stepped into the NFL spotlight, it became the foundation for everything that followed. Unrelenting discipline, a will that refused to let himself collapse, and a habit of enduring in silence that began with a boy who once stood waiting at a door that never opened again. LaDainian Tomlinson's body started carrying the load before his mind even understood what a choice was. While many other kids turned to sports as fun, as a way to burn energy, for Tomlinson, running the ball soon became a quiet duty, a way to exist in a world that had already taught him no one would come to pick him up when he fell. LaDainian Tomlinson didn't run out of pure passion. He ran because it was the one thing that made him feel he had clear, tangible value that couldn't be abandoned. Every time he took the handoff was a mission to complete. Every collision, a test of whether he could get up one more time. And gradually, his body stopped being a part of him that needed to be listened to and became a tool used to meet expectations. Tomlinson was praised as tough from very early on. Adults saw in that boy an unusual resilience, an ability to endure beyond his years, and they praised it as a rare quality. But no one asked what the price of that toughness was, and no one realized that every compliment for his ability to take hits quietly taught the boy a dangerous lesson. Pain is something that can and should be ignored. When he fell, he got up not just because the game required it, but because he was already used to no one coming to check if he was okay. Pain became normal, like breathing or a heartbeat, something in life that didn't need to be named. Tomlinson's body was used from too early, not through deliberate cruelty, but through a chain of seemingly reasonable demands. Practice a little more, run one more time, take one more hit. Each time he pushed past the limit, That boy reinforced the belief that his value lay in his ability to endure, not in his feelings or vulnerability. Pain stopped being a warning signal and became a measure. If he could still stand, he was still okay. If he could keep running, there was no reason to stop. Over time, a dangerous cycle formed. Pain, getting used to it, then silence. At first came sharp, clear pains, bruises, hits that stole his breath for a few seconds. Then came familiarity, as his body learned to adapt, and his mind learned not to react too strongly. And finally came silence, when pain was no longer recognized as abnormal, but just the background noise of daily life. Tomlinson didn't complain, didn't whine, didn't stop to ask if he was going too far, because he had learned very early that crying out in pain brought nothing but weakness the world wouldn't accept. On the outside, people saw a tough kid, a young athlete always ready to dive into contact, a model of resilience. They saw decisive runs, cold cuts, and a body that seemed tireless. But inside, it was still a child who wasn't allowed to cry out in pain, wasn't allowed to stop and check if he was still whole. That toughness didn't come from not feeling pain. It came from learning to ignore pain as if it didn't exist. As he grew older, Tomlinson came to understand more and more that his body was something the world would keep demanding from, and he had to meet those demands if he wanted to keep being accepted. He wasn't taught how to listen to the subtle signals of fatigue or injury. He was taught how to push through them. Every time he succeeded in pushing past his limits, he reinforced one flawed but useful belief, that the body could be forced to go longer, that willpower could substitute for recovery, that rest was a luxury reserved for people who didn't have to prove anything. Tomlinson's physical tragedy didn't start with a major injury or a dramatic collapse. It started with the normalization of pain. When pain becomes normal, people stop paying attention to it. When people stop paying attention to it, it starts to accumulate. His body remembered every hit, every time he was dragged down, every practice that went beyond the limit, even when his mind tried to forget. And in that imbalance, an early version of the double life took shape. On the outside, the image of strength and endurance. On the inside, a child who had learned to lock away every cry for help. No one forced Tomlinson to endure through violence. It was the environment and the invisible expectations that did it. He was rewarded for continuing, recognized for not stopping, and celebrated for turning his body into a tool serving a greater goal. Gradually, using his body to the point of exhaustion stopped being seen as something worrisome and became a virtue. And Tomlinson, who had grown up in a world that didn't allow weakness, accepted that virtue as part of who he was. At this stage of his life, he didn't yet know that the habit of staying silent in the face of pain would follow him far beyond youth, beyond even the brilliant successes that came later. He only knew that if he wanted to keep standing strong, he had to turn his body into a reliable tool. Even if that meant ignoring the warnings his body whispered every single day. And it was in that silence that the physical tragedy of LaDainian Tomlinson began to take root quietly, persistently, and inseparably from the person he was gradually becoming. When he stepped into Texas Christian University, LaDainian Tomlinson didn't arrive with a sense of being chosen. He arrived with the fear of being forgotten. TCU wasn't a powerhouse, wasn't where the media swarmed with cameras, wasn't the automatic launchpad for future NFL stars. To many people, it was just a small school in a college football system that always favored the big names. And Tomlinson understood that from day one. LaDainian Tomlinson didn't walk onto the practice field with the expectations reserved for rare talent. He walked on with scrutinizing looks, with the unspoken question hanging over him. Did he really belong here? Or was he just another name that would soon fade away? It was in that environment that the tragedy of self-perception began to form. In the earlier chapters of his life, Tomlinson had learned not to wait and not to cry out in pain. At TCU, he learned another lesson, no less harsh. Doing well wasn't enough. At a small school, every mistake was magnified. Every success was downplayed. When you come from a place no one expects greatness from, you have to do more than everyone else just to be seen as an equal. Tomlinson didn't just have to prove he was good. He had to prove it over and over, week after week, as if everything before never existed. He ran with the feeling of being watched, not watched to cheer, but watched to catch the moment he slowed down. Every carry was an identity test, every game a survival contest where there were no bonus points for the past. When Tomlinson set records, people noted the numbers, but the familiar skepticism remained in their eyes. Was he doing this because of real talent, or just because of the system, the circumstances, the luck? Those records didn't bring peace of mind, because they didn't erase the fear that one bad season would send everything back to zero. The feeling of never being enough became his main driver, but also a crushing psychological burden. Tomlinson didn't allow himself ordinary playing days. Every day had to be a day of proof. He didn't play to enjoy, he played to survive. While others could accept an average game, Tomlinson saw it as a dangerous sign. In his mind, any slowing down carried the meaning of disappearance. No one said it outright to him, but everything around him whispered it through every glance, every brief article, every ranking where players from big schools were always placed higher, no matter the stats. At TCU, Tomlinson began tying his self-worth to output. If he ran more yards, he had a place. If he scored more touchdowns, he got mentioned. If he led the NCAA, he got respect, but only until the next game. No emotional capital was ever accumulated. Everything had to be earned again every week. Gradually, an obsession took shape, quiet but persistent. If I stop, I will disappear. Not disappear from the field, but disappear from the consciousness of those who decide my value. The most dangerous thing about that obsession was that it disguised itself as discipline and hard work. On the outside, Tomlinson looked like the ideal model. Relentless training, durable play, no complaints, no arrogance. But on the inside, he lived in a constant state of alertness, as if letting up for even one beat would make the world turn its back. He didn't dare believe he had value simply for being who he was. He only believed in the numbers, because numbers were the only thing that didn't quietly leave him the way others had. When the NCAA records were set one after another, they didn't bring relief. Instead, they raised the bar that Tomlinson set for himself even higher. Every new record wasn't a finish line, it was a higher starting line, where he had to maintain or surpass it if he didn't want to fall back into invisibility. In an environment accustomed to undervaluing, he didn't allow himself mistakes, because a mistake here wasn't just a loss. It was proof of the doubts people had already carried in their heads. That mental fatigue built up over the years, but Tomlinson never named it. He called it responsibility, motivation, the price to pay for wanting to go further than his starting point. He didn't see it as fear, because fear was something he had learned to bury since childhood. Instead, he kept running, kept producing, kept proving, as if maintaining that momentum long enough would one day make the insecurity disappear on its own. But it didn't disappear. It only sank down, waiting for bigger stages to return in different forms. When Tomlinson left TCU with numbers that history had to record, he didn't carry solid confidence. He carried a deeply ingrained belief. My value is tied to what I produce today, not what I did yesterday. And that belief, forged during the years at an overlooked small school, prepared him to step into a world far more brutal, where disappearance wasn't just a psychological fear. It was a very real possibility for anyone who dared to slow down even one step. When he stepped into the NFL, LaDainian Tomlinson didn't step into a dream. He stepped into an unspoken contract, where everything endured in childhood and college was raised to a level that allowed no errors. Draft day didn't bring a sense of liberation. It felt more like a cold milestone than a celebration, because the moment the name LaDainian Tomlinson was called, every eye turned to him, as if they had found the single answer to a franchise's years of disappointment. The San Diego Chargers didn't select a player to add to the roster. They placed the entire hope of a franchise on the shoulders of a 21-year-old who had just left a small college, carrying the obsession that stopping meant disappearing. In the NFL, that obsession wasn't erased. It was legitimized. There was no adjustment period, no buffer to learn how to breathe in the new environment, only one unspoken but clear message: save us, and do it right now. Tomlinson arrived with the Chargers in a situation that allowed no delay. The team needed a new centerpiece, a new symbol, someone who could carry both the offensive system and the fans' faith. He wasn't allowed to be a rookie still learning. He had to be the solution from week one. That responsibility weighed on him, not through threats, but through expectations so thick they were suffocating. Every practice, every meeting, every carry carried the meaning of a life-or-death test. If at TCU he had to do more to be seen as equal, in the NFL he had to do more to keep an entire organization from collapsing again. The harshness of the professional environment quickly exposed the double life Tomlinson had begun building long before. On the outside, he was called a star, the future, the center of the team. On the inside, he felt the collective weight clinging to every step he took. He wasn't just running for himself anymore. He was running for a city, for a locker room, for the losing years the Chargers wanted to bury. No one said it straight to him, but everything around him sent the same message. If you don't produce, everything falls apart, and you'll be the first one looked at. The NFL didn't give Tomlinson time to learn how to fail. Every slip, every stuffed run, every game that fell short was magnified by the lights and the stat sheets. Here, yesterday's success didn't buy patience for today. Tomlinson soon realized that what he had learned at TCU, having to prove his value every day, wasn't just still true. It had become the unwritten law of the game. And he, following the reflex forged since childhood, accepted that law without resistance. That burden didn't come only from schemes or the number of carries. It came from the feeling that he was the sole pillar. When the team struggled, eyes turned to him. When a spark was needed, they called his name. Tomlinson learned to accept that role in silence, because silence was what he knew. He didn't ask if it was fair, didn't wonder if he was being used too much. Questions like that didn't help in an environment where results were the only measure of worth. Instead, he did what he had always done: run more, endure more, and keep everything inside. Right here, the double life officially took shape. In public, Tomlinson was the symbol of durability, of extraordinary carrying capacity, of a young player who seemed never to tire. In the locker room and those evenings coming home, he was a different person, carrying the feeling of being forced to be perfect, carrying the fear that just one moment of slipping would make everyone turn their backs. He didn't allow himself to slow down, because slowing down meant putting a question mark over the faith the entire franchise had placed in him. And for someone who had learned very early that if you fall alone, keeping others' belief became a matter of survival. There was no moment in those early NFL years when Tomlinson was allowed to breathe easy. Success came fast, but it didn't bring security. It only raised the bar for the next time. Every good game pulled in bigger expectations. Every impressive stat made the burden heavier. He wasn't taught how to share the load. He was taught how to carry it. And in the process, he reinforced the belief that had taken root back in college: if I stop producing, I will disappear. In the NFL, that disappearance wasn't just a feeling. It was a very real possibility, confirmed by cut contracts, replaced names, short-lived success stories that ended in silence. LaDainian Tomlinson's first professional turning point wasn't an injury or a disastrous failure. It was being placed in the position of carrying everything before he even had time to understand what a choice was. He became the star everyone expected, but at the same time, he became the one bearing the weight of an entire collective. In that spotlight, there was no room for weakness, no space to learn how to adapt. There was only one path: keep running, keep enduring, and keep proving that the faith placed in him wasn't a mistake, even as the price became clearer and heavier by the day. From the moment LaDainian Tomlinson fully stepped into the NFL machine, his two lives weren't just running parallel anymore. They began to clash with each other in a brutal way. Sundays were days of light, of cheers, of stat boards flashing his name at the top. Mondays were days of silence, of closed-door rooms where his body quietly tallied what had been lost. LaDainian Tomlinson became the hero on schedule every weekend, then vanished from view right after, as if two different people took turns existing in the same body. On game day, Tomlinson was the icon. When he touched the ball, the whole stadium rose. When he cut, the defense scrambled. When he scored a touchdown, the world saw only a smooth, precise body, with no sign of hesitation. Television replayed his runs in slow motion. The press wrote about his durability. Commentators called his name like a guarantee of victory. On the field, he wasn't allowed to show fatigue. His role was to bring hope, and hope needed a steady face. He learned to smile, learned to stand tall, learned to turn pain into an insignificant detail in the story the public wanted to hear. But when the final whistle blew, the other life began. No more cameras, no more cheers, just slow steps off the field, heavy pads coming off, and a body stretched to its limit. The bruises didn't make the box score. The aches didn't appear in the highlights. Tomlinson didn't step to the microphones to talk about them, because talking wouldn't change anything. In the NFL, pain isn't the story. Results are the story. And he, following the habit formed very early, chose silence. After every game, he returned to a familiar ritual no one witnessed. Ice packs, taping, stretching, recovery routines repeated like a silent prayer. His body didn't rest in the usual sense. It was patched up just enough to endure one more week. Long nights passed in a half-awake, half-asleep state, where sleep was interrupted by sudden sharp pains, where thoughts of the next game invaded every attempt to relax. He didn't call it suffering. He called it work. When pain becomes part of the schedule, people stop questioning it. No media followed him into those nights. No feature story captured a legend having to deal with his own body in silence. What the world saw was continuity. Sunday after Sunday, Tomlinson kept running, kept scoring, kept being the pillar. And that very consistency hid the central tragedy. He had to split himself to survive. One part of him went to the field, to the fans, to the franchise. The rest shrank into the shadows, where pain was treated like a technical glitch to fix rather than a signal to listen to. Between those two parts was constant tension. He wasn't allowed to bring those long nights onto the field, nor was he allowed to bring the cheers into the recovery room. The two worlds weren't allowed to touch. If they did, the fragility would show. And in a system that worships durability, fragility isn't acceptable. Tomlinson learned to compartmentalize, learned to keep Sunday's face from cracking under what Monday left behind. Every success on the field made that separation thicker, because success demanded flawless repetition. People around him saw him as quiet, disciplined, focused. They called it the quality of a star. But few realized that quietness was a survival strategy. Speaking up meant opening the door to questions. Questions led to doubt. Doubt could shake the role he was carrying. And that role, the burden bearer, had become his identity. Tomlinson didn't just play football. He represented the capacity to endure. Once you become the symbol of that capacity, you no longer have the right to show the opposite. And so the double life ran so smoothly it was almost invisible. Sunday, he was the idol. Monday, he was the self-repair man. Sunday, the world counted touchdowns. Monday, he counted the movements he could still make without too much pain. Sunday, his name was chanted. Monday, he stayed silent to preserve the image for the next Sunday. That cycle didn't allow stopping, because stopping would make the two lives collide and reveal the truth. The body has limits, and willpower can't replace biology forever. No one saw the moments when Tomlinson had to negotiate with himself. Should he report the real level of pain, or just say fine? Should he skip a practice, or push through to avoid suspicious looks? Those small decisions, repeated over the years, wore him down more than the big hits. He chose to continue, because continuing was the only thing that had ever kept him from disappearing. And when that choice was confirmed by on-field results, the world believed even more that everything was still okay. The tragedy lies here. The stability the public saw was built on nights no one saw. The world only saw the touchdowns. No one saw the long nights. The world only recorded the numbers. No one recorded the price paid to keep those numbers from falling. And in the gap between those two things, LaDainian Tomlinson kept living two lives, one celebrated, one self-carried, believing that if he kept them separate long enough, nothing would collapse. But with every week that passed, that separation demanded more of him, and the part taken away was always the part no one knew had ever existed. The year 2006 didn't come to LaDainian Tomlinson like a mountaintop. To stand on and look down from it came like a long slope that began sliding the moment he reached the highest point. That season, LaDainian Tomlinson did things that seemed no longer human. 31 touchdowns, a historical record. The MVP award, Offensive Player of the Year. Numbers that forced the NFL to update the standard for the running back position. On paper, it was a perfect season, a flawless summary. On the field, it was a string of Sundays, where everything ran so smoothly it was almost frightening. But right in that perfection, his body began to collect its debt. The peak didn't come with relief. It came with pressure. When Tomlinson exploded, expectations didn't stop at repeat. They multiplied exponentially. Every touchdown didn't close a task, it opened a new one. Every outstanding game didn't grant the right to rest. It forced him to prove it wasn't luck. Success in 2006 wasn't a reward. It was more like an extension order on endurance, an extension for the body, for the mind, for the carrying capacity that had already been stretched from the years before. Injuries didn't appear as single dramatic events for people to point at and name. They came in the most uncomfortable way, piling up, repeating, simmering. Hits that seemed routine left lingering after effects longer than a week. Pains that had once been patched enough to play now needed more time to settle. Knees, ankles, back parts that had once cooperated obediently started sending signals slower, stiffer, less forgiving. Tomlinson still ran, but he began counting every step. Still scored, but every score came with a bill due the next day. The mental pressure that season was no less brutal. When you're the MVP, you don't just represent yourself, you represent a standard. Every opponent prepared for you first. Every defensive scheme was designed to lock you down, force more hits, force you to create difference in tighter and tighter spaces. Tomlinson understood that if he slowed even one beat, the world would call it decline. If he asked to lighten the load, the world would call it signs of weakening. And in a system that had grown used to seeing him as the pillar, asking to lighten the load meant questioning his own identity. The explosive success exposed the paradox. The greater you are, the less you're allowed to be human. Tomlinson had no prolonged celebration moments, no space to pause and say, "We did it." Every win was just a brief stop to tally the damage before moving on. He smiled for the cameras, answered the familiar questions, then returned to a recovery routine heavier than before. Nights after games grew longer. Mornings grew more labored. The body began demanding attention, but the schedule didn't. In 2006, Tomlinson learned a bitter lesson about the price of consistency. Not every injury shows up right away. Many injuries just build up, waiting for their moment. As he kept running, kept scoring, kept the machine running, he was also postponing the bill to the future. Every decision to push one more week was a decision to borrow from tomorrow. And since tomorrow hadn't come yet, the world kept believing everything was still fine. That pressure didn't just come from the outside. It came from the belief that had rooted deep inside Tomlinson. If I stop, I will disappear. MVP didn't erase that fear. It just dressed the fear in fancier clothes. He didn't dare believe he had value beyond his output. So he kept producing, even when his body demanded the opposite. In the locker room, he kept discipline. On the practice field, he kept pace. In his head, he kept an invisible list of things he had to do to avoid being replaced. There were moments in that season when Tomlinson clearly felt the difference between can and should. He could keep going, but should he? That question was rarely answered with listening. The NFL rewards pushing through, not caution. And Tomlinson, who had learned very early that no one comes to pick you up when you fall, chose the familiar path, push through. The peak of 2006, therefore, had two faces. One bright face for the world, records, awards, history. One dark face for him alone, warning signals delayed, debts logged. There was no big explosion signaling decline, just steady erosion. No celebration moment to close the chapter, just opening a new chapter with a heavier title. When the season ended, people talked about Tomlinson as the perfect icon of the era. They analyzed his runs, his numbers, his records. Few talked about what perfection had taken away. Tomlinson didn't talk either. He didn't complain, didn't blame. He looked at the schedule, looked at his body, and did what he always did when the world demanded more. Keep carrying. No celebration. No stopping. Just moving forward, carrying the belief that if he kept the wheel spinning long enough, nothing would collapse. Even though deep down, he knew that 2006 wasn't just the year he reached the top. It was the year his body began collecting debt seriously, and those debts could never be erased by awards. The decisive moment didn't come like a lightning bolt. It came like a dry no from LaDainian Tomlinson's own body at the moment he needed it most. The playoffs weren't a stage for tests. They were where every sacrifice got cashed in, where years of carrying had to find the final answer. LaDainian Tomlinson stepped into that moment with everything he had accumulated: discipline, awards, reputation, and then realized some things couldn't be brought along. A body that had been stretched too long. The injury wasn't loud. It didn't need drama to assert its power. It just needed the right timing. And cruelly, that timing was exactly when the team needed him most. The world saw Tomlinson there. His name was still on the list. The lights still shone. But inside, the familiar machine had locked up. Movements that once happened on instinct now required negotiation. Every step was a question without a satisfactory answer. Can I go one more beat without paying the price of total collapse? In the playoffs, there was no room for caution, no space to listen to the body. The game moved faster than recovery could keep up, and Tomlinson, who had lived by pushing through, faced a limit he couldn't overcome for the first time. That moment froze many things at once. The career didn't end, but it was left hanging. In the years before, he had learned to hide warning signals, patch the body enough to continue, but here, patching wasn't enough. The body said no in a language that couldn't be negotiated, and the world, without waiting, kept going. The game didn't stop. The script didn't slow down. The playoffs showed no mercy to anyone. Tomlinson was there, but he couldn't be himself, and that difference was enough to change everything. The deepest pain wasn't in the physical feeling. It was in the realization that everything he had ever believed, that if he pushed a little more, took one more hit, stayed silent, one more night could collapse in a single moment. When the team needed him most, the body betrayed. Not because he lacked will, but because the will had been used to borrow for too long. That betrayal wasn't personal. It was biological. But reason doesn't help much when you're standing on the biggest stage of your life and can't perform what has defined you for decades. After the game, the world analyzed schemes, looked for reasons, moved on to the next story. That's how football works. Fast, cold, no looking back. For Tomlinson, time slowed. The images that replayed in his head weren't highlights. They were unfinished moments, runs that weren't complete, decisions skipped because the body wouldn't respond. He didn't need anyone to tell him this was a defining moment. He felt it. Not because of a loss, but because a door had closed in a way that effort couldn't reopen. Silence became thicker than ever. No media followed those nights after the playoffs. No one recorded his process of facing the new truth. Some battles you don't lose because you're inferior, but because you've paid enough. Conversations with his body became brief, because the answer was already clear. He could still show up, but he couldn't show up the way the world expected. And in a system that only counts what you can do, not being able to do the familiar meant being pushed to the edge of the story. That helplessness cut deep into an identity built on output. All his life, Tomlinson believed his value lay in being able to continue. The playoffs posed an unavoidable paradox. If you continue, you might lose everything. If you stop, you might lose yourself. He stood at that intersection where there was no right choice, only the less painful one, and even that wasn't certain. In the fading lights, he realized the double life he had maintained for so long was no longer airtight. The world saw the absence, and he saw the price. The next day, the world moved on. The schedule continued. Other names appeared. That wasn't human betrayal. That was the nature of the game. But for Tomlinson, that movement carried a different meaning. It confirmed there was no moment reserved for those who had given too much. No pause to mourn. No ritual farewell for the parts of the body that had been sacrificed. Just the relentless flow and the demand to keep up one way or another. In the days that followed, the pain was no longer a specific ache in a joint or tendon. It was the feeling of losing control. It was the realization that you had done everything right by the game's unwritten rules. Discipline, silence, pushing through. But those unwritten rules promised nothing when the bill came due. Tomlinson didn't blame anyone. He didn't curse fate. He just looked straight at the new reality. Some moments can't be reversed, and those playoffs were one of them. The deepest pain, therefore, wasn't failure against an opponent, but failure against a limit. When they needed him most, the body betrayed. Not because of lack of preparation, but because preparation had gone on too long in an unsustainable way. That moment took many things at once. The illusion that willpower could replace biology, the belief that silence would always be rewarded, and the hope for an ending where every sacrifice was wrapped in a redeeming image. Instead came a stark truth. The world only sees the touchdowns. No one sees the long nights. And when those long nights spilled onto the biggest stage, the world had already moved on. Tomlinson stood in that gap, present but no longer himself, carrying the bitter understanding that the peak doesn't protect you from the moment the body says no. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't ask permission, doesn't negotiate, doesn't wait. It arrives on time, takes what it needs to take, and leaves a man to learn how to live with the truth that some things, even if you've carried them your whole life, still can't be held when the decisive time comes. After those playoffs, the story didn't end with a specific loss, but with a void that stretched through the rest of his career and the years beyond. LaDainian Tomlinson stepped off the biggest stage with everything he could carry: records, awards, respect, but missing the one thing American football uses to stamp every sacrifice: the Super Bowl ring. No redemption moment, no collective release where all the pain gets gathered and called worth it. For LaDainian Tomlinson, that absence wasn't a small detail. It was a hanging symbol, reminding him that some paths can be walked to the end and still not reach the destination the world expects. In the NFL, the ring isn't just jewelry. It's a short answer to long questions. It lets people look back and say, everything was worth it. When you don't have it, the story is forced to stay open, and the questions have nowhere to hide. Tomlinson didn't lack what football considers great. He had the stats, the impact, a historic season, but there was no final moment to close it. No frozen image where the pain transformed into a complete symbol. Instead, there was continuation of effort, of discipline, of hope that next time would be the last time he had to push. The haunting question didn't come as a scream. It came in silence, repeating, patient. Was my suffering enough? Were those long nights patching the body enough? Were the years of silent carrying enough? Was becoming the one the whole team relied on enough? Tomlinson didn't ask that question in public. He asked it in private moments, where no comforting answer waited. And the most painful part was, football doesn't promise an answer. It only promises opportunity, and opportunity isn't fair. No Super Bowl means no redemption moment. When you get injured at the moment you need it most, when your body says no at the decisive time, the ring doesn't come to soothe that sense of betrayal. The world can talk about circumstances, about bad luck, about things beyond your control, but for someone who has built their identity around control, those words aren't enough. Tomlinson isn't looking for excuses. He's looking for an ending that can hold everything he gave. And because it's not there, the story unfolds differently, longer, heavier, and without a period. The absence of the ring creates a bitter paradox. The more great things you achieve, the clearer that void becomes. Every time people mention him in lists of the greatest running backs, the but question appears right after, not from his mouth, but from the context. But no Super Bowl. That but doesn't deny the greatness, but it keeps the pain close. It makes every reflection return to the same point, like a compass needle that refuses to leave north. Tomlinson tries to move forward the way he always has: discipline, silence, focus. But this conflict isn't like the ones before. You can't outrun it by running faster. You can't fill it by scoring more touchdowns. You can't make it disappear by adding one more practice session. This conflict lies in the fact that no action is enough to resolve it. It exists like an open question, and open questions don't get tired. It waits for you in ordinary days, in moments without cheers to drown it out. No redemption moment also means no ritual farewell. Careers that close with a ring often have an emotional order: pain, then release. Tomlinson doesn't have that order. He has the pain, but no matching release. That forces him to learn how to live with the absence as part of the story, not as an exception. And living with it doesn't make the pain go away. It just makes you more accustomed to carrying it. Here, the double life shifts into another form. One public life celebrates a greatness that doesn't need the ring. One private life weighs every memory through the lens of what wasn't achieved. Those two lives don't reconcile. They run parallel, sometimes colliding, but never merging into one. Tomlinson doesn't allow himself bitterness. He also doesn't allow himself to forget. That middle ground, not resentful, not forgetful, demands a different endurance, quieter than any hit on the field. The question, was my suffering enough? Isn't seeking recognition from others. It's seeking peace from himself. And peace is the hardest thing when the story lacks a closing symbol. No ring to set down, no moment to say it's done. Just continuation of life, of responsibility, of finding meaning beyond familiar measurements. That's a heavy lesson. Some conflicts are never resolved, only carried until you learn to walk without them disappearing. The world moves on, as it always does. New seasons arrive, new stars emerge, new rings are handed out. Tomlinson stays with his question, not flaunting it, not complaining. He understands that no answer is enough to close it. And it's precisely in accepting that lack of closure that another kind of courage forms the courage to live without the guarantee that every pain will be rewarded. The conflict remains, unresolved, unpackaged. It just sits there, reminding him that some great stories don't end with cheers, but with the persistent silence of someone who has given enough to know that not every sacrifice takes a shape you can hold. After all the unanswered questions, LaDainian Tomlinson has only one place left where he doesn't have to prove anything. Home. Not home as an address, but the space where he's allowed to disappear from the role that defined him for so many years. For LaDainian Tomlinson, private life isn't an appendage to his career. It's the final refuge, the only place he's permitted to be tired without asking permission, without explaining, without producing. Outside the field, everything runs on the rhythm of demands. At home, the rhythm slows, not because time is more plentiful, but because body and mind are finally allowed to be heard. No whistles, no stat sheets, no how's this week, questions, just silence thick enough to protect. Tomlinson doesn't need to say much there. He's already spoken through action his whole career. At home, he allows himself not to speak. Family becomes a soft buffer against the sharp edges of public life. Simple meals, evenings with no schedule, small but enduring moments, all of it creates a sense of safety the field never promised. There, he's not the workhorse, not the icon, not the answer for a franchise. He's a man coming home after a long day and accepted even when he brings nothing to show. Faith, for Tomlinson, isn't loud. It doesn't appear as an explanation for success or a justification for failure. It exists as a quiet pillar, reminding him that worth isn't measured only by what you produce in front of crowds. When the question, "Was my suffering enough?" still hangs there, faith doesn't answer for him. It keeps the question from destroying him. It allows him to believe there's meaning even without a closing symbol, that there's peace even when the story isn't complete. The silence at home isn't like the silence on the field. On the field, silence is strategy, a way to preserve image. At home, silence is a right. Tomlinson can sit still without feeling he's losing something. He can be tired without fear of being misunderstood. The body accustomed to being demanded of is finally allowed to rest in the fullest sense of the word, not to prepare for another week, but to simply exist. It's here that the double life reverses. If on the field he's the one carrying the load, at home he's the one being carried, not by grand comforts, but by steady presence, not by solutions, but by not being asked for anything. That reversal doesn't erase the cracks, it just keeps them from spreading further. And sometimes, that's enough. Tomlinson doesn't bring field stories home like reports. He brings fragments, fatigue, thoughts, sometimes emptiness. There, those fragments don't need to be pieced into meaning right away. They're set down, left alone. That's the greatest luxury for someone who has lived by turning everything into results, to be left alone. There are evenings when he just wants to disappear from every label. Not disappear by running away, but by not being watched. No one tracks how he sits, how he breathes, how he moves. No one counts steps. No one waits for an explosive moment. Normalcy, once a luxury, becomes the medicine no stat sheet can measure. At home, Tomlinson relearns a forgotten skill, allowing himself to be imperfect. No need to win every day. No need to be ready all the time. When the body says enough for today, the response isn't push a little more, but okay. That small thing, a consent, carries profound healing. It teaches him that tiredness isn't failure, and rest isn't betrayal. The shelter of private life doesn't erase the symbolic questions of his career, but it relocates them. The questions no longer stand in the middle, no longer dictate the rhythm of life. They're set aside, where they can be looked at without suffocating pain. Tomlinson doesn't have to answer them every day. He just has to keep living slower, deeper, truer, and perhaps it's precisely in the one place he's allowed to be tired that LaDainian Tomlinson finds another kind of victory. Not victory over opponents, not victory over history, but victory over the need to always carry the load. At home, he's not the Sunday hero. He's a man coming back, and this time, allowed to set the burden down, even if only in silence. He never talks much about his father, not because the memories are faint, but because they're too sharp to touch. For most of his adult life, LaDainian Tomlinson has carried the image of a man who left too early, leaving behind not just a family without him, but a void that was never named. When the news of his father's death came, it didn't arrive like a sudden lightning strike, but like a door closing forever, before two people could ever stand on the same side. LaDainian Tomlinson was already a star then, an icon of strength and discipline, but inside, he was still the child from years before, who never got the chance to ask why he was left behind and never heard an explanation or an apology. His father's death brought no reconciliation. It brought complete silence. No final meeting, no handshake between two men who had endured enough pain to understand each other, no moment to say that the past, no matter how harsh, could be set down. For Tomlinson, it was a particularly cruel loss, because he didn't just lose a person, he lost the chance to heal. Some wounds can be stitched by time, but others just freeze, lying there, not hurting every day, but still perfectly intact whenever they're touched. In the years that followed, Tomlinson rarely mentioned the event in public, not because he didn't hurt, but because he was too used to swallowing the pain inward. His father's departure forced him to face the old lesson from childhood once more. Not every loss comes with a goodbye, and not every story gets a fair ending. That only reinforced how he lived, not expecting closure, not demanding explanations from life. On the field, he kept running as if every play was proof. Off the field, he kept silent, as if silence was the only way not to break. That pain didn't collapse him, but it made him close off more. Tomlinson became careful with emotions, restrained with words, and almost never let himself fully rely on anyone. Even in his own family, he often chose the role of the carrier, rather than the one needing comfort. He believed in responsibility, in duty, in standing firm to the end, because deep down, he knew that there are times when, if you fall, no one will come back to pick you up. His father's death also made Tomlinson see more clearly the fragile nature of time. The years spent grinding on the field, enduring hits and injuries, were suddenly placed next to a cold truth. There are things that, if you don't face them in time, are lost forever. But instead of resentment, he chose to keep moving forward, carrying the pain as an inseparable part of who he is. He didn't turn it into a story to tell. He turned it into a quiet force, driving him to live more responsibly, to be a better father, and to not repeat the cycle of abandonment that had once shaped his childhood. This isn't loud pain. It doesn't involve tears in front of cameras or emotionally charged statements. It's the quiet pain of a man who understands that some conversations will never happen, and some questions will never have answers. Tomlinson learned to live with that, not by forgetting, but by accepting that silence is sometimes the only legacy of a relationship that never had the chance to fully form. And in that acceptance, he kept walking, carrying the wordless loss as a deep but enduring part of himself. Leaving the NFL for LaDainian Tomlinson wasn't like a door opening. It was like a cut made while the blood was still flowing. There was no moment of relief, no sense of liberation after the decision was made. Retirement came not because he was ready to let go, but because his body no longer allowed him to keep lying to himself. LaDainian Tomlinson walked away from the game in a state of suspension, where reason knew it had to be done, but emotion stayed stuck on the field, among the yard lines and the habits that had been ingrained for nearly 2 decades. The body left the game before the mind did. Mornings came without practice schedules, without recovery plans, without the pressure to be ready for the next Sunday. But there was also no feeling of lightness. The body still carried the memory of every hit, every overload, every push, a little more decision that had become a survival habit. Even though he no longer played, the pains still showed up on schedule, reminding him that stopping didn't erase the bill. They just changed form from pain to keep going, to pain to remember. Tomlinson's mind stayed in the NFL long after his body had left. He still thought in the rhythm of the season, still heard the roar of the stadium in his quietest moments. Some days, he caught himself unconsciously judging everything in football language. Prepare, execute, result. But now, there were no games to reference, no chances to get it right next week. That emptiness wasn't loud. It was quiet, prolonged, and harder to name than any injury. The lack of closure is what made this process especially heavy. Tomlinson had no ring to set down as a period, no final moment to say everything had been paid for. He didn't leave to cheers of a fulfilling ending, but in the quiet acknowledgement that continuing would cost more than what was left. That decision was more moral than strategic. Stop to avoid losing more. Stop to preserve the parts of himself the field had already taken too much from. Retirement, therefore, wasn't liberation. It was acceptance of limits, the hardest thing for someone who had lived by pushing past limits. Tomlinson didn't learn how to let go. He learned that he could no longer continue. Those two concepts are profoundly different. Letting go implies choice. Being unable to continue implies helplessness. And helplessness, for someone who built his identity on control, is the most bitter experience. In the early days after leaving the NFL, he still kept the discipline as if tomorrow he'd still play. Waking up early, training in moderation, keeping the body ready, not because there was somewhere to go, but because that was the only way he knew how to exist. Gradually, he realized that discipline needed a new purpose, or it would become an empty loop. But the new purpose didn't come right away. It didn't arrive with an announcement, didn't come with a replacement role big enough to fill the void. The feeling of still playing but without a field made Tomlinson tired in a different way. Not tired from contact, but tired from not knowing where to put the energy. When he was playing, all fatigue had direction. Prepare for the next game. After retirement, fatigue had to be digested, not converted. That required a new kind of patience. Patience with himself, with the process of redefining worth beyond familiar measurements. No closure also meant memories refused to lie still. Moments frozen in the playoffs, unanswered questions, the repeating what-ifs in his head. Tomlinson didn't avoid them. He learned to let them pass without clinging. That was a skill not taught in any NFL playbook, and no coach ever drilled it. It was learned in quiet evenings, when there was no noise left to shield him. The most painful part of this phase was realizing that a career doesn't end with a neatly closed door. It ends in a long transition zone, where you're no longer who you were, but you don't yet know who you'll become. Tomlinson moved through that zone with the caution of someone who understood the cost of rushing. He didn't rush to fill the void with anything loud. He let the void exist, because filling it wrong hurts more than leaving it empty. Walking away while still bleeding isn't exaggeration. It's the reality of someone leaving the game while the wound hasn't healed, while the story hasn't closed. Tomlinson didn't carry bitterness. He carried honesty. Honesty that some endings don't bring relief. Honesty that stopping doesn't always mean recovery. And honesty that sometimes the bravest thing isn't continuing, but accepting the stop even when you're not ready. In that acceptance, LaDainian Tomlinson began to learn a new rhythm of life, slower, harder, but necessary. Not to forget the NFL, but to put it in its proper place in his life. Not to find excuses for what was lost, but to protect what remains. And even without closure, even with the cut still throbbing, he kept walking, not as someone set free, but as someone who chose not to lose any more in a life that had already given so much. After the crowds leave, what remains isn't the echo of glory, but the weight of what was taken. For LaDainian Tomlinson, post-fame doesn't look like deserved rest. It looks like a quiet room, where memories ring louder than any cheer ever did. LaDainian Tomlinson didn't enjoy the spotlight the way people usually imagine. He didn't live by reminiscing, didn't replay footage to find comfort. When the lights went out, he didn't chase them. He let them go, because some people get closer to the light and see more clearly the dark corners it never reaches. Fame leaving creates a different kind of fatigue. Not fatigue from labor, but from memory. Memory of years that gave more than could be measured. Of push a little more decisions that accumulated into long-term debt. There's no need to boast, because boasting doesn't return time, and it doesn't make the body lighter. Tomlinson understood that once certain things are taken, the elasticity of joints, the carefreeness of youth, the assurance that effort is always rewarded, no hall of fame can make up for it. He chose to live simply, discreetly, staying away from the noise of nostalgia, invitations, tributes, repeated questions about the greatest moment. All were met with just enough politeness, no more. Because for Tomlinson, the greatest moments usually came with the heaviest price, and digging into them only made the memory sharper. He didn't deny the past. He placed it where it belonged, not at the center of his present life. Living with painful memory doesn't mean living in bitterness. It means living in awareness. Tomlinson realized that post-fame requires a different discipline, the discipline of not letting what was lost control what remains. He didn't use achievements to shield sadness, nor did he use sadness to deny achievements. The two existed side by side, unreconciled, but not canceling each other out. That's how he stayed balanced in a life without a game schedule to lean on. Not boasting is also a moral choice, because boasting often leads to comparison, and comparison never ends. Tomlinson didn't need to prove he gave more than others. He only needed to know he gave enough not to regret lack of effort, even if he still regretted incomplete results. That distinction is subtle, but crucial. It allowed him to keep living without getting trapped in the loop of what if. Some days, memories arrive uninvited. A smell of grass, a metallic clank, an afternoon that feels like the ones that used to end with ice packs. On those days, Tomlinson didn't push the memories away. He let them pass, like waves he knew how to let recede. Painful memory was no longer an enemy to defeat. It was a part of personal history to be respected, but not worshipped. Legend, therefore, doesn't mean relief. That title doesn't bring instant peace. It brings a new obligation, to live in a way that what was sacrificed doesn't become a reason to stop in the present. Tomlinson didn't turn himself into a museum of his own past. He didn't hang the past on the wall to stare at every day. He lived with it in the background, like a layer of sediment, enough to remember, not enough to block the way. After the crowds, what remains are small habits, steady rhythm, patience with the body, restraint in emotion. No cheers to cover the fatigue, but also no pressure to perform for anyone. This is where post-fame shows its true face. Not dazzling, not comforting, but honest. And that honesty, though heavy, is still lighter than having to play the hero one more time. Tomlinson understood that some victories are only visible after the crowd leaves. The victory of not letting the past seize the present. The victory of not using glory to compensate for what was lost. The victory of continuing to live decently with himself, even when the story doesn't close completely. He didn't seek relief by denial. He accepted the heaviness as part of his legacy, not to show off, but to keep it true. And in that post-fame life, LaDainian Tomlinson walked neither fast nor slow, carrying what had been taken as a memory with weight, but never letting that weight break what remained. A legend, yes, but not lightened, only solid enough to keep living without needing the cheers. He never asked for sympathy. LaDainian Tomlinson moved through the post-fame years with the same principle that guided him on the field: discipline, silence, and accepting the cost without demanding anyone acknowledge it. LaDainian Tomlinson never built himself a victim narrative. He didn't blame circumstances, injuries, bad luck, or a system that always demanded more than it ever returned. He lived right, and understood that living right doesn't guarantee an easy ending. In American culture, there is a kind of tragedy that doesn't need public tears. It lies in the way a person keeps working when the body is weary, keeps promises when the heart is heavy, keeps standing straight when there's no audience left. Tomlinson belongs to that kind of tragedy. He doesn't talk much about what was lost, because talking doesn't bring it back. He chose to keep the rhythm steady, slow, enduring like a man who believes dignity doesn't come from being pitied, but from not asking for it. His discipline isn't showy. It lives in small habits, in the way he cares for the body that remains, in the way he arranges his life to avoid repeating old mistakes. That discipline no longer serves a specific Sunday, it serves a harder goal: to keep living without denying what happened. This requires courage, because there's no scoreboard to prove it, no cheers to confirm it. Only consistency, the thing least celebrated but decisive for everything. Tomlinson's silence isn't avoidance, it's a moral choice. He understood that complaining can bring instant attention, but it also wears down the truth. His truth is simple and heavy. Some sacrifices aren't repaid the way people expect, and accepting that is part of growing up. Silence, in this case, is the way to keep the truth from being turned into a slogan. Not blaming is the hardest thing, because blame brings a sense of order. It gives you a place to put the anger. Tomlinson didn't choose that path. He looked straight at the chain of his own choices, without self-punishment and without self-excuse. He understood that every push, a little more decision, had its reason in the moment, and every bill that came due was the accumulated result. That honesty didn't make the pain disappear, but it kept the pain from turning into bitterness. Honoring tragedy isn't hanging medals on sorrow. It's acknowledging that some people are great because of how they endure, not because of what they demand. Tomlinson didn't seek attention for the long nights of recovery, for the mornings waking up to a body that no longer obeyed. He considered it part of the job with no contract, no bonus, but still needing to be done to stay true to himself. Living right, even at a cost, is a wordless declaration. It shows in not using the past to force the present. Tomlinson didn't use fame to demand favors, didn't use achievements to cover very human shortcomings. He chose to walk straight slower, but straight because veering sideways through complaint would take him somewhere he didn't want to go. Dependence on other people's compassion. The American-style tragedy he represents isn't loud. It doesn't need background music. It doesn't need a conclusion. It exists in unadorned persistence, in keeping promises to himself, even when there's no reward left. Suffering without complaint isn't denying emotion. It's refusing to let emotion control character. Tomlinson allowed himself to be tired, allowed himself to be sad, but didn't allow himself to blame. There are days when old memories return, when unanswered questions knock. He didn't chase them away with loud words. He let them sit there, like uninvited guests, until they left on their own. That's emotional discipline, the kind no one teaches in the locker room, but the kind that decides how you live when the locker room is gone. Honoring him, therefore, isn't by reciting every stat, but by seeing the straight line he chose. A straight line that doesn't promise brilliant light at the end, but guarantees that every step stayed true to the original values. Tomlinson lived right with his work, with his family, with his community, and with his own body. even when that body answered no when he needed it most. In an era that loves quick explanations and instant comfort, LaDainian Tomlinson chose the harder path. Endure without complaint. Continue without boasting. That's American tragedy, cold, enduring, and worthy of respect. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because it doesn't require anyone to witness it in order to have value. He didn't lose. He endured. And in this story, that isn't understatement. That's the most accurate conclusion. LaDainian Tomlinson reached the end without a championship ring, without a redemptive moment to wrap all the pain into an easy-to-remember symbol. No late miracle arrived to say it was all worth it. All that remains is the most honest thing. A body that paid enough, a man who endured enough, and a life no one saw in full. LaDainian Tomlinson didn't need an exclamation point to finish. He needed a period. Looking back, people can count the numbers, rank him on lists, mention the seasons that changed history, but numbers don't tell the whole story. They don't record the long nights of self-repair, the mornings waking to a body that no longer listened, the push a little more decisions that piled into unerasable debt. They also don't tell of the silences when the world wanted a simple answer and he only had complicated truth. No championship ring, therefore, isn't a flaw. It's the consequence of a life where carrying the load was always prioritized over self-preservation. No redemptive moment, because redemption demands a stage that closes on cue. Tomlinson had no such stage. Playoffs came early, left quickly, and left questions that refused to lie still. Retirement didn't open relief. It only forced him to stop when he could no longer continue. Post-fame didn't grant instant peace. It demanded a different discipline, the discipline of living with memory, without letting memory control. Family and silence became the refuge, not to escape, but to set the burden down in the right place. A body that paid enough that needs no debate. But what's more worth saying is a man who endured enough. Enough to not blame. Enough to not boast. Enough to not turn himself into a victim story in a culture that loves quick explanations. He chose the harder path. Endure without complaint. Continue without demanding pity. American tragedy, cold, enduring, and straight, was present there. A life no one saw in full because the most important part happened off the lights. Decisions that never made the scoreboard. Pain without highlights. Values that didn't need an audience. Tomlinson lived two lives, not to hide, but to survive. In a world that rarely allows people to be whole, both strong and tired, both giving and needing rest. When the world only saw Sundays, he lived the rest of the days to keep balance. No miracle came to validate those sacrifices. And perhaps that's exactly what makes this story believable. Because miracles often blur the truth that many great lives don't end with cheers. They end with the persistent silence of someone who did everything possible under unfair conditions. Tomlinson didn't need a miracle to prove his worth. He needed honesty to keep living without betraying himself. In this final stretch, what remains isn't the what-if question, but a quiet affirmation. Affirmation that effort isn't always rewarded the way we expect, but dignity doesn't depend on the reward. Affirmation that enduring isn't failure when it comes with the right choice. Affirmation that some people are great because of how they held the straight line, not because of what they gained at the end of the road. LaDainian Tomlinson didn't need comfort through comparisons. He didn't need excuses through circumstances. He lived right in a game that never promised fairness, and stopped when continuing would take too much. That was a moral decision, not a tactical one. And that decision, though it brought no brilliant light, still kept the rest of his life from being burned away. Absolute tragic ending isn't an empty finish. It's an honest finish. No championship ring, but a body that paid enough. No redemptive moment, but a man who endured enough. No miracle, but a life lived fully in the only way possible. Within the harsh limits of time and biology, LaDainian Tomlinson didn't live a double life to hide from the world. He lived it because the world never gave him permission to be whole. The story of LaDainian Tomlinson leaves a quiet sadness, not loud but persistent, because his tragedy isn't in one dramatic fall, but in a lifetime never allowed to fall. From a child growing up with a father's absence, Tomlinson learned very early how to stand on his own, and that lesson followed him through his career. Don't wait, don't complain, don't expect anyone to come back and lift you. On the field, it turned him into one of the most durable and reliable running backs in NFL history. Off the field, it turned him into a man accustomed to living in silence, carrying heavy wounds without explanation. His career peaked with historic seasons, records, and individual honors very few ever touched. But that very detail makes the ache sharper. The greater the greatness, the greater the price he paid. A body worn down, accumulated injuries, playoff moments when the body said no exactly when the whole world needed him most. All of it showed success, had become an extension order for endurance. His retirement brought no relief, because his mind stayed in the NFL, and memories kept knocking every day. What's most admirable about Tomlinson is how he faced all of it. He didn't blame circumstances, didn't use pain to demand pity, didn't boast despite giving almost everything. He chose family, faith, and a quiet life as the final refuge. The lesson for Americans from this story is very clear. Success doesn't exempt a person from hurt, and real strength isn't always in victory, but in the ability to endure decently, to live true to one's values, even when life doesn't deliver the full reward. If the story of LaDainian Tomlinson's quiet endurance and dignity touches you, please hit subscribe to keep joining us on the journeys behind the glow of American legends. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video, where another life will be told with truth, pain, and respect.